The Spanish now approaches the decks of the port of Mariel in Cuba. Piloting the ship is Antonio de Alaminos, the famed Spanish navigator. Now in his 40s, he has seen more of the New World than perhaps any other Spaniard, having piloted the voyage of Cristobal Colon. A favorite of the Cuban governor, Diego Velázquez, he was personally selected to pilot the ships of the first de Córdoba and then Grijalva expeditions into Old Mexico. This time, however, he is piloting men who seek not to assist the governor, but undo him. Francisco de Montejo and Alonso de Portocarrero, the two appointed procuradores under Cortés, are meant to carry news of the Cortesista expedition's findings to the king in Spain. The orders were strict. Go directly to Spain. Do not, under any circumstances, stop in Cuba. Even a whiff of the Cortesista plans reaching the nose of Velázquez could lead to an army of Spanish chefs attempting to gain control of the Cortesista kitchen. But orders are given to be broken. Montejo, a Velázquista and Comodero, has told Alaminos to ignore his previous orders and sail them all back to Cuba so that he can check up on his estates. If, while ashore, however, he happens to let rumor slip of the Cortesista schemes to buck Velázquez's authority, then so be it. In the intermingling gambles and conspiracies of the Spanish colonial world, this is only one more bet to hedge. His companion, Portocarrero, nephew to the Count of Medellin and a personal friend of Cortés, is too sick to contest Montejo's change of direction. He has fallen ill with a violent case of seafaring diarrhea. When he learns of the change of plans, he is simply relieved to have an excuse to get off the ship. The usual resupplying is made while on land. Water, bread, and pigs are led onto the ship to prepare for the long voyage to Spain. Workers are brought aboard to load and unload the goods. And it's during this process that one of these men, a servant of Montejo's, notices that there is more to the ship than meets the eye. For a brief moment, below deck, he spots the secret of this now, a treasure so immense and varied he can hardly believe his eyes. Straining his neck and squinting, he attempts to get a better look. Before he can do so, Montejo has fallen upon him, closing the door and demanding the servant to explain what he has seen. As the servant stammers out an explanation to his master, he is interrupted. Montejo tells his servant that he has seen nothing, and swears the servant to secrecy. But as he does so, however, Montejo gives a wink to the servant, mixed signals the man can hardly parse out. Later that evening, in the company of his fellow workers, the servant decides to leave parsing to the parsers and, partway through his fourth glass of wine, lets loose to the others what he has seen. Everyone stares at the servant in wide-eyed amazement. The gold the Spanish have been searching for in the Caribbean has been found in the land they still call the Yucatan. Word travels fast on the island, until it reaches the ears of Diego Velázquez. The old Cuban governor's anger is volcanic. While he can't be certain what exactly Cortés is planning, this delegation of procuradores with a ship full of treasures sneaking around his island does not bode well for his prospects. The next day, as Antonio de Alaminos brings the ship out of port with Montejo and Portocarrero on board once again, Diego Velázquez orders them to be pursued, boarded, and arrested. The procuradores, however, are unaware that they are in a ship race for their very lives, and sail off to Spain with news that the long-floundering Spanish colonies will soon become an empire. Hello, and welcome to Can't Go Back, Won't Move On, a paranoid historical storytelling podcast dedicated to seeing the history of the Americas from within the visions of the people who lived it. I'm your host, Gavrilo Z. This season has been examining the conquest of Mexico, an event often portrayed as the matchup of glistening soldiers of Spanish steel against the noble but doomed Aztecs. What we have been arguing instead is that this is yet another in history's long association with hallucinations, warped by the reality-bending effect of power and its prerogatives. Last week, we saw the Spanish unwittingly being conscripted into the power games of the Totonacs and at the mercy of the translations of Malintzin. They had carried out a legal coup against Velázquez by founding the town of La Villarica de Veracruz, and now sought to build a tangible empire in Old Mexico out of their fantasies as they set out on the long march toward Tenochtitlan. This week, instead of continuing the story of Cortés and the conquistadores following their coup, we will instead follow the journey of those men dispatched to carry that coup back to Spain, and legitimize it through the reality-shifting powers of the Spanish court. Francisco Montejo, as a one-time Belasquista, and Alonso Hernandez Portocarrero, a Cortesista devotee, were the men handpicked to do it. Each of them would have their own motivations for what they hoped to achieve with their time at the Spanish court, but the foundation of their efforts wasn't nostalgia for Spain. Instead, they set off to defend the crime of conquest in the courts of Spain and hold off the gallows of Velázquez. Their story would shed light on an underappreciated element of the conquistadores' campaign against the Aztecs: that it was a war of laws as much as steel, a great game whose rules had been set in centuries of Spanish precedent, and rules that ensured that no matter what was gambled, the house of the Spanish crown would always win. Let us now turn our attention to that gamble in this week's episode of Can't Go Back, Won't Move On, a podcast where history isn't a story repeating, but a conspiracy unfolding. Episode 1.9, Montejo, Portocarrero, and the Happy Fiction of Legal Treason. The Cortesista faction of the Third Spanish expedition into Old Mexico had defeated the Velasquistas on the insufferable beaches of the Gulf Coast. By constituting themselves into a fictional town outside the domain of Velázquez's gubernatorial holdings, they in effect made themselves directly answerable only to the Spanish king. Or, at least, that was the plan. In reality, this was legalese, whose legitimacy would be determined not by lawful justifications, but through the sheer force of whose greed could outmatch whose. The captains of this expedition, Cortés, Pedro de Alvarado, Gonzalo de Sandoval, and Andrés de Tapia among them, conspired to lay the groundwork for a rhetorical sleight of hand. Perhaps they had committed treason, but if they did so, it was in the name of old Spanish municipal law, and it was treason against an unjust and tyrannical appointee of the crown and not the crown itself. In fact, it was treason in service to the crown that they were now arguing. Their conquest, such as it was at this point, had only the barest of facts to go off of. There was an empire which spanned the lands they had been investigating, that its capital was Tenochtitlan, that its ruler was a man named Moctezuma, and that it was fabulously wealthy. While the conquistadores pursued this train of thought to its terminal end over the next 2 years, they used 2 of their men, Montejo and Portocarrero, to wage the legal conquest against Velázquez and his allies at the Spanish court back home. It was a game of chance that they indulged in, which required an enormous payoff to cover the debts wagered, financial and legal, debts which were quickly accumulating interest. Bold claims require bold success to back up. And as all these men knew, for all their legal posturing, the greatest asset to them would be the fact that, in the words of historian J.H. Eliot, nothing could obliterate the stigma of treachery and rebellion better than a brilliant military success and acquisition of fabulous riches. Montejo and Portocarrero were strategic choices by the conquistadores to send back to Spain. Montejo had been a staunch Velasquista and a leader of that faction who had doubted Cortés from the very beginning. Choosing him served 2 functions. First, it would give an air of impartiality to the Procuradores' mission. Second, it would cut off the head of the Velasquista snake. Portocarrero, on the other hand, was from Extremadura, the frontier region of Spain that Cortés, Alvarado, and so many of the most trusted allies of the 2 hailed from, and was in fact related to the Count of that region, making him the highest-ranked member of the Spanish nobility who had taken part thus far in the conquests. Of the 2, Montejo, in the words of Hugh Thomas, seemed more a man of business than one of war, yet he was extravagant, open-handed, cheerful, and liked merriment, being also an excellent horseman. Born a commoner, he represented the up-and-coming members of the aspiring merchant class of his era, and wore his new wealth like a proud aristocrat. He was evidently rich enough to have funded, in part, the Grijalva expedition. Portocarrero, by contrast, was more brutish and unrefined despite his relation to nobility, being unable to speak without swearing, and came from a line of nobility so poor and peripheral that he was unable to buy his own horse for the expedition. But the proudest nobleman is the poorest one, and he wore his pedigree like a shield to deflect all accusations of brutishness and bullying. He was, when it was all said and done, a member of the better class. These two procuradores were loaded onto one of the fleet's ships with all of the treasure secured thus far, as well as important documents to aid their petition to the king for recognition of their exploits. The supplying of all the treasure was a brilliant maneuver by the captains of the expedition. As we saw in episode 1.6, only a fifth of all profits from the expedition were legally entitled to be sent back to the Spanish crown. The Cortesista conquistadores, however, saw that there might be immeasurably more wealth to be found in this new land, and wagered that the enormity of this treasure would be enough to entice the crown into backing their plans to secure more. Cortes remained paranoid to the very end that any hint of what he had discovered in this new land would leak back to Velazquez, something which he feared would prompt an immediate, newly commissioned expedition to come and claim it in the governor's name, even or especially at the price of Cortes's head, and the heads of all those who supported him. Velazquez, remember, had selected Cortes out of a hope that this mediocre colonist would be too short-sighted to do what Velazquez himself was scheming: use the justification of newly discovered land to earn an independent license to conquest from the crown and release him from authority of his own boss, Diego Colón. In the world of the Spanish colonies, it was all against all, and relationships and the network of power that governed those colonies were respected up until the point an apprentice could knife his master in the back and assume the role himself. Cortes was well aware that, again quoting J.H. Eliot, Moctezuma was in some respects the least dangerous of the enemies whom Cortes had to face, and that he had more to fear from his own countrymen than from the Emperor of Mexico. It was not the last time that Cortes would have to divert his attention away from his main goal in order to fend off the ambitions of other Spaniards. In fact, there had already been a plot from within the Conquistadores Velazquista ranks to send additional men sympathetic to the governor aboard Montejo and Portocarrero's ship, men who could then commandeer the vessel and inform Velazquez about what was happening ashore Old Mexico. The plan was quickly foiled, however, when one of these conspirators got cold feet and confessed. Upon learning of this defection, the Cortesista faction had them all hanged. And so Cortes gave explicit instructions to Montejo and Portocarrero that under no circumstances were they to stop anywhere in the Spanish Caribbean. They were only to go directly to Spain. So the two, with a number of indigenous and African slaves and servants, set sail, and promptly went to Cuba, continuing the running tradition of Spaniards betraying their fellow colonizers at the earliest convenient opportunity. Despite what Cortes had said, each of the two men leading the voyage had their own reasons for returning to the island they had sailed from only months earlier. Montejo wanted to check on the status of his Cuban estates and ensure that his affairs were all in proper order. Portocarrero was suffering from gastric distress, essentially puking and shitting himself from a combination of seasickness and tropical disagreement, and wanted to take a moment to reset himself before sailing off on the more arduous 2-month journey back to Spain. And so they landed in the port of Mariel and took their time in preparing to leave again, delaying their departure back to Spain until the 23rd of August, several months after landing. Compounding their tardiness was the fact that Montejo had a servant come aboard the ship to load provisions for the voyage to Spain. And while aboard, that servant caught sight of the Aztec treasure and promptly began to gossip about it. While not immediate, word eventually did reach Diego Velazquez's ears that some of Cortes's men had come back, without Cortes, and were planning to sail to Spain with enormous riches and a fabulous story of how they got them. This indiscretion could have been coincidental, Montejo simply following his own agenda and inadvertently leaking information, or it might have been a strategic consideration of Montejo's to play both sides off each other until the victor became obvious. Regardless, it prompted Velazquez into his counterattack, one that would have deadly consequences for both the Spanish and the Mexica the following year. But that's all to come in time, and for now let's turn our attention away from the colonies and back to the metropole and catch up on the Spanish monarchy since we last heard from it in episode 1.4. As we've seen from the exploits of Cortes up to this point, he had made frequent occasions to inform the people of Mesoamerica that their lands had been claimed in the name of the Spanish crown. Careful listeners will have noticed that I have avoided naming exactly who it was wearing that crown. The answer, like so much else in this story, is complicated. So let's start with what is simple. The Catholic monarchs, Isabel and Ferdinand, whose sponsorship of Cristobal Colon's voyage to the Americas had initiated the Spanish experiment, did not live long enough to realize the consequences of what they had done. The accomplishments of their empire would not be fully understood until the middle of the 16th century, decades after their deaths. Queen Isabel, pious and humorless as ever, had died in 1504 over a happy kingdom and a miserable life. Her reign was seen as largely successful, having united Spain with the marriage of her husband who survived her, Ferdinand. But her life had been marked by the tragedies of her children's death, which, even in her eternal devotion to God, she could never reconcile her heart to. But her kingdom survived her, as the realm of Castile she had ruled over and her husband's realm of Aragon, in combination with the completion of the Reconquista, had made Spain a united country for the first time in centuries. But even that notion of Spain as a whole represented a kind of fiction itself, for the marriage of Castile and Aragon did not formally unite the two realms into one political entity until hundreds of years later. Instead, each of the monarchs had a carefully laid out set of rules and regulations about who could do what with each realm. Upon the death of Queen Isabel, power of Castile, by far the most important of the two kingdoms, was not inherited by Ferdinand. The reasons for this are complex and can be explored by seriously interested readers in Hugh Thomas's book Rivers of Gold, which is all about the beginnings of this Spanish Empire. But the rub was this. Isabel and Ferdinand had only managed to produce one viable heir, a princess named Juana. All other possibilities, other siblings and a cousin, had all died. There were two problems with Juana. The first was that while Castile allowed for dynastic inheritance by women, Aragon did not. Upon Ferdinand's death, Aragon would fall into the possession of the closest male heir, a move which could possibly fracture Spain politically once again. The second problem was this. Juana had once been married off to an Austrian Habsburg prince named Philip in 1496. When Isabel died 8 years later, the crown of Castile passed to Juana and her husband, beginning Habsburg rule over Spain that would last for centuries. But Philip died the same year he became king. Rumor had it that he had overexerted himself in bed with his wife. After the death of her husband, Juana, never that sound of mind to begin with, took a turn for the worse. Her father, who was not legally in charge of her kingdom, had her confined to the prison of a royal palace where she would remain for the rest of her long and unhappy life. Ferdinand announced himself as governor and regent of Castile until his own death in 1516. Ferdinand's death further complicated an already complex situation. Juana was clearly unfit to rule, but was legally unimpeachable. So it was decided that she would be co-ruler with her Flemish son, the heir presumptive Carlos, from 1516 onward. While she may inherit the kingdoms of Spain, she would never rule them, and this put the Spanish court and Spanish power into a difficult position. This Flemish prince, now king, Carlos, was born in 1500, and so was only 16 years old at the time of his ascension to the Spanish throne. The king that Cortes was attempting to colonize a continent for was only just a boy, and a gangly boy at that, one who was described by those who knew him during his childhood in Flanders as of mediocre stature, and so thin that one cannot believe it, pale, melancholy, always with his mouth open. That last reference would be indicative of the infamous Habsburg jaw, the result of constant family inbreeding. Carlos did not impress during his younger years, despite what was to come. A foreign representative at his court wrote that he was also cruel and willful, and had no value of any kind, and was completely governed by others. He was also considered to be lanky and with eyes that seem glued onto his face. This is all perhaps a bit unfair, given that anyone who has ever known a 16-year-old is aware that gangliness, awkwardness, and the occasional cruelty are all a part of what makes teenagers teenagers. Still, however, most teenagers do not find themselves in positions of power nearly as important as Carlos did. Carlos, like all children, needed guidance and tutoring if he was ever to become a successful monarch. Chief among his many educational influences was Adrian of Utrecht, a sophisticated and far-sighted Dutchman who would later become Pope in 1522. But before Adrian was that, he was simply the future emperor's tutor, educating him in all things courtly and dignified. He also impressed upon the boy a deep and sincere piety, motivated by the belief that Carlos, in position to rule over kingdoms across Europe, was the one true defender of Christianity against the Muslim kingdoms encroaching ever closer from the east. This kind of education naturally leads to supreme self-confidence. That self-confidence, mixed with youthful inexperience, leads to predictable errors. Shortly after his ascension, Carlos made his first regal mistake by dismissing all the Spanish ministers of his grandfather and appointing his own preferred Flemish advisors. The Spanish aristocrats predictably complained. Carlos found himself embroiled in an aristocratic rebellion in the lands he had only just inherited. Complicated bureaucratic shuffling then took place, and out of the fracas rose an important Spanish minister who ascended to power in the new Carlosista regime. He was a man by the name of Juan Rodriguez de Fonseca. He was the Bishop of Burgos. Bishop Fonseca was born in 1451 in the province of Zamora in the very heart of the Kingdom of Castile. He descended from a long line of insiders to the Spanish court who were as well connected as anyone among the unruly and fractious nobles of the Spanish kingdoms. He was deeply invested in the idea of Spanish empire, having served under Antonio de Nebrija, while the man had written the first formal organization of Spanish language, a tool of empire, Nebrija had claimed, while Fonseca would eventually organize the second expedition of Cristobal Colon to the new colonies. Fonseca was also a staunch ally of Diego Velázquez in the Caribbean, supporting the Cuban governor as a friend in the high place of the Spanish court. Cortes, who kept himself updated on all the going-ons of the Spanish court, had heard of Bishop Fonseca incidentally up to this point, but would come to know him intimately in the way that only the bitterest of enemies can. Of all the legal phantoms which would haunt Cortes in the years to come, Fonseca was second only to Velázquez. King Carlos's claim to the throne of Spain was not the only one he inherited, and he would come to rule over lands that stretched across the lowlands, through Germany, and down into Austria. He also held titles in Italy due to his grandfather Ferdinand's obsessive efforts on the peninsula. But the biggest title of all he secured after only 3 years on the Spanish throne. Through an unprecedented campaign of electioneering and bribery, Carlos also won the title of Holy Roman Emperor. As a result of his efforts to secure this, Carlos would begin his reign with a legendary debt that would complicate his ambitious imperial designs in Europe and abroad. The position of Holy Roman Emperor is a tricky one to describe. Essentially, it was a role that presided over an enormous patchwork of kingdoms, duchies, estates, and noble lands across Western and Central Europe. Despite its name, it would be infamously described by Voltaire as neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. It was instead a collection of squabbling princes and dukes. Through this title, he was also, in name, the protector of Christendom, second only to the Pope in importance of the Christian faith in Europe. For most of European medieval history, the Christian faith in Europe meant the Catholic faith, as controlled by the Vatican and Rome. All of that would change, however, with the seismic interruption that was the Protestant Reformation in 1517, one initiated by Martin Luther in Wittenberg, Saxony, right in the heart of Carlos's Holy Roman Empire. All of this digression has been to say that when Carlos I of Spain became Emperor Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire 2 years later in 1519, he had something of a mess on his hands. And the problems did not stop there. With so many kingdoms to attend to, Charles V, as he'll be referred to from now on, was constantly on the move with his court, traveling from realm to realm, putting out fires and initiating wars against anyone and everyone he saw as an impediment to his regal motto of plus ultra, a Latin phrase meaning further beyond, an indication to how Charles saw his empire. He would spend nearly a quarter of his life in transit, moving from location to location, requiring anyone who wanted an audience with him to follow the courtly proceedings from place to place, exhausting their own resources, time, and patience following the emperor abroad. Holding so many kingdoms meant defending and expanding so many borders through war. Wars require money, and money had to be granted or borrowed. As Spain was the heart of his empire, he leaned on it heavily for money to fund his expeditions. But as a foreign king attempting to implement centralized control, he couldn't have picked a more volatile realm to do so. Nowhere in European history has the debate between centralism and federalism defined the politics of a nation as much as it has in Spain. A division running back centuries, it has periodically exploded into armed conflict as Spaniards take sides and massacre one another in an attempt to establish one system over the other. The aristocracy of Spain, already pissed about so many Flemish appointees to the royal court to rule in the absence of their Carlos, refused their foreign king's demands for funds and threatened another such one of these explosions of kingdom-wide violence. With Spain on the brink of total meltdown, Charles was forced to return. Bishop Fonseca, taking the temperature of his fellow aristocrats, made a plea for Charles to grant concessions to Spain, including the appointment of Spanish officials to the Spanish court, at the very least, and more autonomy for Spain in the absence of their emperor. Charles felt his arm being twisted and, in badly need of the money, conceded. And so the Spanish aristocracy were able to extract their demands from their beleaguered Caesar, who gave in before setting off to Germany, promising to return within 3 years. The Spanish nobles were hardly sad to see their king leave. Content with the reforms and autonomy they had secured, they enjoyed the freedom of ruling an abandoned kingdom in line with their own priorities. The imprisonment of a mad queen mother, a continent on the brink of tearing itself apart over different rights for the same god, and a teenage emperor who now held half the continent in his own lap. This was the mess that Montejo and Portocarrero found themselves in as they arrived in Spain. They had been sent by Cortes with riches and unknown people to dazzle Europe with the promises of a land of untold riches, waiting to be exploited and incorporated into the greatest existing empire that any of them had ever known. But for all the treasures they carried with them and hoped to exhibit across the continent, what Montejo and Portocarrero had that was of the most importance couldn't be weighed in pesos. That was Cortes's letter and the documents produced by the citizens of Veracruz, the beginning of a lie that was to be repeated until it resembled something approximating truth. And while they sailed across the ocean sea and chased Charles across half of Europe seeking an audience, they were also shaping the existence of a reality based in a fiction that would become so convincing that even Caesar himself would have to believe it, if only to save face for what had been done in his name half a world away. But of course, this was all assuming they could reach the emperor. Owing to that Spanish tendency of regionalism versus nationalism, a compromise had emerged in which the capital was simply where the king was in Spain at the time. Charles continued this tradition and held no official capital for his entire empire. So many kingdoms, so little time. And as we said, spent much of that time in transit. Montejo and Portocarrero would lose months traveling across first Spain and then Europe, hunting down their king in order to secure an audience. But first, the duo arrived in November 15 in Seville, the point of departure and return for all voyages to the Caribbean. They believed the emperor to have been in Barcelona and immediately made haste for there. Or at least they tried. All Spanish voyages to and from the Caribbean went through the House of Trade in Seville. And who else do we find in control of this house at this time other than our new friend Bishop Fonseca? The officials he appointed to run the house were as staunchly pro-Velasquista as the bishop himself, and, suspicious of these men's mission, seized the treasures aboard until further notice. And so the procuradores' plan was nearly ruined from the start. They could speak all they wanted to about the treasures found in Old Mexico, and the legal promise of the town they had founded there, but without the treasure to entice the emperor into believing the lie of the documents, they would be left arguing for their treason with nothing better than a "trust us, your majesty." Literally missing half their argument now, the two pressed on, enlisting Cortes's own father, Martin, to aid their cause in favor of his son. By the time they made it to Barcelona, the emperor was now in Tordesillas, 750 kilometers away. They would become the newest in a long line of irritated Spaniards who wondered why it had been so difficult to track down the King of Spain within the Spanish kingdom. By the time they reached that king and made their argument to him, it was now April 1520, and the circumstances in Mexico had drastically changed, though it was impossible for them to know that. The seizure of their treasure in the House of Trade was only the beginning of their difficulties. Bishop Fonseca, head of that house, also held the position of Minister of all affairs of the West Indies, making his word on colonial policy final, superseded by only the emperor himself. Any action to be taken in regards to the Cortesista expedition would have to go through him. Also at the court was the Dominican friar Bartolomé de las Casas, the eternal critic of the Spanish Empire, an agitator on behalf of the Indios. We last saw de las Casas sulking as he complained about the Velázquez mission of pacification of the Cuban island. The endless massacres of that campaign had cemented the friar's position that the Spanish Empire was irredeemable until it prioritized the salvation of the Indian souls in deeds rather than simply words. Having known Cortés himself while in the Caribbean, de las Casas knew him to be a vain, wily man who was as charming as he was brutal, and no friend to either the Indians or de las Casas himself. And while de las Casas was no friend of Fonseca, he had nothing but scorn for Cortés as well. Montejo and Portocarrero had been hoping to avoid Fonseca altogether. As procuradores or representatives of Veracruz, they theoretically held the permission to appeal to the king directly and circumvent the bishop's authority. But theory is no match for reality, and reality became even further complicated by the fact that, unbeknownst to everyone, including Velázquez himself, the crown had granted him the title of adelantado over the Yucatan, all the way back in November 1518. Essentially, much to the Cortesista misfortune, he was already the royally appointed conqueror of this new land that included everything that Cortés and his friends had explored so far. This had been done well before Cortés had even set out to sea. But of course, with an entire ocean between the crown and the colonies, it would take weeks, if not months, for the news to have reached Velázquez, and even longer for Cortés and his captains to learn of it. Not that they would have heeded it anyway. Montejo and Portocarrero realized that their strategy would have to adapt. The two appointees of Cortés would argue, in combination with Cortés's letter and the founding documents of Veracruz, that the expedition was in fact one of evangelization, that their chief mission was to spread Christianity throughout the region and convert the heathens to the one true faith. Charles, as Holy Roman Emperor and protector of Christendom, would surely have to give such an argument its due consideration. The two procuradores would also argue that they had been granted the ability to settle by Velázquez himself in the original contract, which had included a clause, negotiated by Cortés himself, that gave the expedition the authority to exercise extraordinary powers in extraordinary circumstances, circumstances which were conveniently left undefined. The two men would further insist that it was only by the demands of the men of his expedition that Cortés committed himself to betraying Velázquez at all. The two procuradores also got lucky that the impounded treasure in Seville had caused a fervor, and word had quickly spread about its magnificence. This word had even reached Charles's ear, and he ordered the treasure released and brought to him around the same time Montejo and Portocarrero finally reached him. The treasure had its intended effect and deeply impressed the king, while Montejo and Portocarrero were able to score further political points against Bishop Fonseca. The bitter divisions in the Spanish court between Charles's Flemish ministers and his Spanish ones had already weakened Fonseca's position, which was then further deteriorated with that activist Dominican friar Bartolomé de las Casas publicly denouncing Fonseca for the treatment of the indigenous in the colonies that had happened under his ministership. The King of Spain heard all of this, deliberated, and then made no final decision on awarding Cortés the legal right to his conquests. Far from feeling defeated, however, the procuradores saw this as a partial victory for their own camp. By deferring his judgment, Charles had at least avoided branding these men as traitors to the king and having them hanged for their actions. The emperor would depart Spain for Germany in May 1520, leaving behind Montejo, Portocarrero, and Bishop Fonseca, all to sharpen their knives, trying to get the last word out of the king in the future. And this was how the drama then played out over the next several months. Appointees of each side of the conflict would make their case to the king, who would hear them and then defer a final decision until later. And this could go on indefinitely. Charles was an absolutist monarch in the age of peak European absolutism. There were no other authorities to turn to, and all decisions of this sort had to be made through the monarch eventually. The system was inefficient, undemocratic, and frequently leveraged as a way for bickering parties in all affairs to stall for time, as they hoped for the other side to die or give up before the king could say one way or another how justice was going to be served. It was also perhaps by the design of Charles himself. He had seen enough of the Aztec treasure to be suitably impressed, and undoubtedly considered the financial implication of these conquests. What gain did he have to interfere when he could so easily defer his decision on the matter until the time someone came out on top, at which point the infallible Emperor Charles could make his decision that yes, the winner of this battle of wits and steel was indeed the one that he considered legitimate, and praise be to the glory of God for giving him this insight all along. It would not be the first time that a king would wait until he saw the last man standing before picking a side. This legal drama played out on one side of the ocean sea while another kind unfolded on the other. In the age of sail, the information lag between the two worlds was such that any news from either would take weeks, if not months, to be heard. It was another element of the whole affair someone could either regard as a feature or a bug, depending on which eye you looked at it from. Cortes had gotten lucky that the decision to grant Velázquez adelantado status had failed to have its intended effect before Cortes was able to set sail. And surely Cortes would reason that the element of time was on his side and not the much older Velázquez. And so while each side played its hand at shaping history in their own image, the unstoppable march of time ate away at the age and advantages of Velázquez, who knew that his position was in danger and that every delay saw his ultimate prize slipping further and further from his grasp. Cortes, by contrast, could use the lack of information to his advantage more easily, pleading ignorance while having advocates at the moving court of Emperor Charles constantly badgering him for support of this expedition, and having each deferral leveraged as a half-victory. With the rearguard legal battle at a stalemate under the uneasy alliance of ambition, treason, and legalism, Cortes and his captains would look to the disgruntled periphery of the Aztec Empire to forge their own uneasy alliances of Spanish and indigenous forces to make their march on Tenochtitlan and wage a different kind of conflict, one which, they hoped, would lead straight to the most dramatic collision of two worlds that history had ever known. So that's where we'll leave the story this week. Cortes would not win Mexico through battle alone. He would have to create the myths that would become the conquest's history through the sheer force of convincing narrative that could survive not just a bloody war, but the Spanish court. The men that he sent may have been procuradores, but they were not lawyers. They were Trojan horses of that myth, who came with an invented paper trail concocted by men who knew that for all the legalism of the Spanish Empire, it was as susceptible to seeing the law as the court wanted to see it, and not as it was to be seen. And this myth of legality would arrive in Spain at a time of near lawlessness. Its king was now an emperor, and one who had nearly lost his claim to his original kingdom with the rebellion of aristocrats who bristled at the idea of putting up real pesos for the phony wars of a Flemish king imposed on them through the quirks of inheritance. Charles V was not the majestic statesman that Cortes was portraying him as across the ocean, but a teenager in the midst of his own development while he fought wars in Europe that he hadn't started, ruled over lands he'd never seen, and wielded an authority that was less real than it was imagined through the forces of death, marriage, and its own mythology. The actions of Cortes and his procuradores was one more bet wagered that Charles would be more interested in Aztec gold than he was in Spanish law. It was, in some ways, a bribe for the king to bless a successful crime rather than put down a legal treason. Just as Tlacaelel and Itzcoatl had burned the inconvenient truths of their own history in order to rewrite a grander myth of their own determined success, so too would the Spanish crown. So for Cortes it was a gamble that would pay off, but only in part. As we know, these victories at court were always half victories, shadows, their own kinds of polite fictions or historical illusions. Cortes and his fellow conquistadores had not heard the last of the likes of Velázquez and Fonseca, and their actions one day would become so egregious that the crown would swipe away this private venture and integrate it into the public realm of its own empire building, doing away with the men who had seized these lands in the first place. The lands that had been conquered by the Spanish sword would be seized again by the pen of the always rewritable Spanish law. But we'll have to wait to see the conclusion of how that legal drama plays out. For next week, we will explore the unconquerable Tlaxcalans and continue to examine the conflicts between them and the Aztec Empire, and how this Tlaxcalan ulcer in the empire's stomach was able to nearly defeat the Spanish entirely before appropriating them for their own ends. So that's all for this episode of Can't Go Back, Won't Move On. Written, narrated, and produced by Gavrilo Z, with music composed and performed by Jake Krasiniak. If you like the show, tell your friends. All my listeners are appreciated. Goodbye.